There's a fantastic book called Decolonizing Methodologies by Linda Smith, an Indigenous researcher. And the question goes like this: is her spirit clear? Does he have a good heart? And I like to remember this book when I embark on research exercises. Am I doing it for the right reasons? Will my research help people? And I want to be really careful not to be extractive, because academia has a long and unproud history of doing exactly that, taking from people for often the academic's own self-aggrandizement and enrichment. And I want to make sure I'm not doing that, because I saw that happen a lot in my career. So the question I asked is one of gender and racial media representation, and what is its impact on communities? It's a complex question. And as is understood from the previous podcast that I pulled together, this is the 9th in the series, gender and racial representation in media isn't a magic bullet for inclusion initiatives or broad-based social change, nor is the presence or absence of diverse gender or racial representation received in the same way by publics, communities who participate in social and cultural activities. Marginalized communities are not monoliths with the same reactions, thoughts, and attitudes toward representation and representation's importance in media. Media representation doesn't instantly solve socio-cultural challenges in community inclusion and cohesion. Neither does equitable racial and gender representation eliminate the threat of harassment, abuse, or violence faced by marginalized and vulnerable people. Nonetheless, my research exercise sought to locate any linkages between the absence of representation in the board gaming hobby and how that lack of representation is perceived and acted upon by marginalized employees, creatives, gamers, and other members of the wider hobby community and the industry itself. And so this podcast is going to outline how I did this research, the methods I used to collect and analyze data, how my participants were involved, and I use a participant action research model, which means my participants were my peers in pulling this together. Any of my ethical considerations as I conducted this research, I wanted to look at those. I also wanted to really evaluate and reevaluate my assumptions, delimitations, and limitations while I conducted this work. And we're going to talk about some of those in this podcast today. So remember, my research questions were: what are the demographic profiles of designers of the most popular board games as identified in Board Game Geek? And was there a lack of representation in that labor? My second research question was: to what extent does board gaming cover artwork on popular board games evince limited or inequitable demographic representation? My third question was: does that lack of diversity among board game designers and a lack of representation of women, non-binary, Black, Indigenous, persons of color in artwork act as a barrier for board games' cultural potential growth and wider mainstream cultural adoption? And does it create the conditions for exclusion and marginalization for those who identify as women, BIPOC, or LGBTQ+? How does limited representation, and this is the fourth and final question, and diversity impact board game enthusiasts in spaces where gaming is practiced? And that includes public gaming events, conventions, online forums, and on digital platforms. So to answer these research questions, I used a variety of research methods. First, I knew I needed a method to determine the relative number of Black, Indigenous persons of color, women designers involved in the making of top-ranked games, and specifically those games that represented that top 400 on Board Game Geek. Then I needed a way to explore, in a systematic manner, gender and racial representation in the artwork featured on the covers of the board games themselves. In both cases, I decided to undertake a numerical analysis of designers by racial and gender dimensions, and then I needed an analysis to determine the raw numbers of human, animal, and alien figures that appeared in the box art of the top 200 Board Game Geek ranked games. This numerical analysis required textual and visual analysis methods, which I'm going to discuss in more detail. After I assessed the current state of the industry in terms of the diversity of designers and board game artwork, I knew I wanted to understand how representation matters or doesn't to members of the board gaming enthusiast community, as well as those who work in the games industry. To accomplish this, I constructed an extensive and wide-ranging online survey, which was launched at the end of 2020, to determine what active members of the community say they think and feel about issues pertaining to representation, equality, equity, diversity, and inclusion in the board gaming hobby and industry. Does representation or lack thereof matter when purchasing, playing, or overall enjoying the board gaming hobby? How do marginalized members of the hobby and industry experience matters of inclusion or exclusion based on race, ethnicity, gender presentation, or sexual orientation? And then I wanted to do a semi-structured qualitative set of interviews where I gathered detailed perspectives of women, BIPOC, LGBTQ+ members of the board gaming industry about what it's like to play in board gaming spaces. And I'm going to explore each detailed method below in this discussion, outlining the overall approach that I used and the process, steps, data sources, and/or participants, and what is the analytic framework that I used for each method. So the first one is that mixed method approach. So it's a bunch of different ways to get to my answers. And that's what mixed methods is all about, is multiple different ways and methodologies to find out what are the answers to these questions in a very rigorous and detailed way. So, first of all, I used content analysis and a coding framework that was inspired by the Inclusion and Invisibility Comprehensive Annenberg Report on Diversity in Entertainment, otherwise known as CARD. CARD looks at the participants of the film and television and web series industries, both behind the camera and in front of the camera. And that decision to look at both behind the scenes in the labor of making these games and to look at what appears on the box presented to the game's consumer was informed by that CARD methodology. And these were really, really helpful guides to see how the research was structured, where the emphasis was placed, and how they coded each and every film, television show, and web series. It was very rigorous, and there was numerical counts of the women and BIPOC playable and non-playable characters in video games as well. So these methodologies have been used extensively by other media scholars. And my other approach was to look at how board game cover artwork in my study was done previously. And in this case, Aaron Ryan in 2016, who's an independent scholar and game study enthusiast, did a really, really cool study that found that there were more games with sheep on the cover than women. And this study assessed the board game artwork by examining something called prominence of certain types of representation on board game covers. And so that prominence, how prominent that figure was, is a bit of a different approach than I decided to use. And I'm going to explain why in a moment. And so while my work is more focused on raw numeric totals as opposed to prominence, which is a very, very good advertising-centric approach where it's who is in the foreground, who is bigger than everybody else, and that's used all the time in the ad industry. So she provided an instructive and rich guide to undertaking this analysis, but I ultimately decided just to do a raw numeric count as opposed to a prominence analysis. And I avoided prominence because it can require of the researcher a little bit of subjective assessment, particularly with images that are highly variable across a wide variety of non-standardized cover art formats. In advertising, it's a little easier because there's a little bit more of a standardization. And so with board game cover artwork being so divergent, I thought prominence might be too subjective. And with a sample of this size and variability of image construction, that complexity of prominence-based assessment, I feared people would say, oh, you made a subjective choice. Now, you cannot win, because I can tell you that I got a lot of those criticisms regardless. I did not look at prominence, nor did I look at how these figures were being portrayed. I simply did a raw count. So prominence analysis is often used in that more standardized, established advertising format. And like I said, board game boxes are wildly variable. There's tons of different aspect ratios, non-standard approaches, and I just felt like it would be a less useful analytical tool. And so these questions and process steps used to formate that quantitative counting, online data analysis, and the online survey with qualitative semi-structured interviews was informed by Fox and Tang 2018, which is a study of female online multiplayer gamers. And it looked at the coping strategies these gamers employed, including things like gender masking, pretending not to be a woman, disguising their gender identities, of course, denial of the presence of harassment, which is another coping strategy. People just discount it, or they tell themselves that the harassment wasn't an issue for them. Some blame themselves, and ultimately avoid game environments entirely, so just opting out, which is all of the different types of coping strategies a woman in gaming might use. And further, I looked at something that was done by Davis 2013, which featured the qualitative interviews of about 57 women who played board games and video games, and featured questions about time, childcare, work responsibilities, as well as matters of representation and inclusion, informed the design of my online survey. I really, really loved the way these different surveys really got at some of the core issues and had some really helpful conclusions that informed my survey. By no means were they the same, but a lot of the ideas around things to ask about really, really helped me. And content analysis is one of the more tricky aspects of my research, and I'm going to talk about that more in a second. So like I said, content analysis can involve the quantification of findings to allow the strengthening of a qualitative assertion, lending it factual weight. And as I've shared in previous podcasts, I know that there's a lot of people out there that value numbers more than anecdotes or stories. Having worked for businessmen my whole career, I know they like numbers better than they like people. So I decided to go with this approach. Watching how people argue online, argue in the boardroom, I thought it needed that thump, that weight of numeracy in terms of where the emphasis was in terms of gender and racial representation. So I wanted to work with the site of current cultural practice, and this was very hotly debated when I was doing this research, but I chose Board Game Geek because it had millions of page views every single month and reflected a crowdsourced, although imperfect, snapshot of what people in North America, in Europe, in English-speaking countries were playing and buying. So I picked Board Game Geek. And Board Game Geek has a really, really robust set of ways in which people can engage with board games. So there are 3 types of rankings, which include user, average, and geek rankings. I'm going to explain them in turn. Well, BGG, Board Game Geek's ranking system can be a little bit opaque, even to long-term BGG users like myself. This user-driven data source, I felt, really provided that excellent snapshot, like I said, of what might reasonably represent the current cultural practice in board gaming and the evolving preferences of avid board game hobbyists. And further, BGG, and I'm very defensive about this because it was, again, very hotly debated within academic circles as I pulled this together, I felt that the BGG source provides details of the game's production history, the designers, artists, publishers involved, and in many cases are crowdsourced directly from the game designers themselves and the companies that created these games. So it was a very good one-stop shop for a lot of really rich data. And a lot of people use BGG in this way. And again, why? Because BGG has that 2 million registered users, and it's even higher now. And had a database at the time when I was doing this intensive research of more than 135,000 games. And so that felt very robust to me. And I wanted to pick the top 400 Board Game Geek games, do a database pull of those 400 games, which happened in the summer of 2020. It involved downloading the information about them into a Google Sheets file. Then I looked at the top 400 games and realized there was about 6 million user votes at that time. Okay, so exactly, in this case, 5.99, just to be exact. And they were buoyed, these games, to this top rank status by millions of active BGG users worldwide. Now, we all know that not everybody who visits a site participates and ranks and votes in this way, but this was pretty robust with about 6 million folks weighing in. Each game entry had many data fields and files associated with it, and each entry had information about the publishers, publishing date, artists, designers, game weight, complexity, type of game, in-game mechanisms, as well as user-submitted photos relating to the game, including cover art, photos, game setups, game components, players playing the games. You got to see in situ how these games looked, and in many cases, the game designers included the sample of that top 400. They had pretty robust BGG game profiles on the site, which included, in some cases, biographical information. Some designer profiles even included photos, avatars, micro-badges that included representations of things important to the designer, such as flags for their home countries, game preferences, playstyles, membership in fandom communities, social causes, and other identifiers. And this was really helpful to me. So when those designer-created and maintained BGG profiles did not exist, I had to search for this information about the designer's self-identification from press and influencer interviews with designers on hobbyist sites, the designer's own LinkedIn pages, their Facebook, Twitter, Instagram profiles, personal websites, other biographical sites for information on the designer's ethnic, racial, gender identification, etc. And this was a pretty laborious process of data collection and validation. It was important that I locate the designer's own assertions of their gender, racial, and ethnic identification. That was critically important to me. And this requirement was based on my own coding framework and approach, as well as that designer's own identification. And I felt that was really important because some of these identifications are evolving. We're complex people, right? And everybody has and can make changes. So I wanted to make sure I was tracking very carefully how everyone identified. I opted to catalog and count all of the fauna, so animals, and human representation of cover artwork. And there's a reason for this. Anything that was alive, I wanted to count. And my decision to limit my focus to the 200 Board Game Geek Rank games was done for reasons of time, because you're going to see in a moment how detailed this process was. And of course, I was limited by my own direct access to games themselves in order to facilitate the process of accurate data collection. I didn't want to rely on fuzzy photos online. And I must say, this process was very labor intensive, very similar to the process of cataloging the designers. Analysis involved looking at the top surface of the box only. Okay, so the packaging of, this 200 contemporary board game, just the top cover. In a previous study, I did all surfaces of the game, but for the purposes of making this much bigger, I wanted to just look at the top of the board game cover, not the sides, not the back. And the rationale here was this surface, that top, the first thing you see when you're looking at a board game, would be reviewed by a potential purchaser or player and could influence purchase decisions or play decisions. It's marketing, as I made the argument in an earlier podcast. And in this case, I conducted manual counts based on racial, ethnic, and gender analysis frameworks that I described earlier, but I'm going to talk a little bit more about in the moments to come in this podcast. I focused only on representative images on the front of the box. And so I didn't look at things like publisher logos or graphical legends that indicated the number of players for the games. In some cases, they were very stylized. I decided to exclude those because they're a bit industry standard. And so that coding process that I did for the board game artwork involved manually counting every single individual on these boxes, whether they were animals or people. So that means giant crowds of soldiers, so many of those, horses, birds, figures in the distance, shadowy humanoid figures. And the details were captured in 9 coding categories. 1, white male presenting. 2, white female presenting. 3, BIPOC, black indigenous person of color, female presenting. BIPOC, male presenting. Male race undetermined. Female race undetermined. Gender unknown. Animals, and finally aliens and fantastical creatures. So creatures that didn't exist. And based on new discoveries I kept making throughout the process, this coding process required many checks and updates as I went along. And a raw count would have allowed me to uncover, I felt, the representation on a relative scale and illustrate some of the larger patterns that I was seeing. I took many field notes of my impressions of the relevance and prominence of women and BIPOC identities on the cover art for later reference. And if when I noticed something strange, I wrote it down. And I'm going to share some of those findings with you. Back to the designers, I want to explain the coding system I relied upon to quantify the gender and racial makeup of the game designers responsible for those top 400 games. I wanted to make the coding system flexible, open to recalibration, based on those emergent aspects and characteristics of the data. I didn't want to be inflexible there because I kept discovering new things. And so what am I talking about when I talk about racial identity? How did I determine, whether someone was white or another racial identification? So in this coding design, my one fundamental question I needed to answer was, what does it mean to be white, and what does it mean to be Black, Indigenous, or a person of color? And this is a complicated question because race is a socially constructed idea. It's not real. However, it is something that plays out in our societies. It is a construct created by changing political and social norms and alliances. And so we're going to talk about that for a second here. So the emerging field of whiteness studies looks at some of the foundational ideas that can be used to explore what has long been considered the default identity of those in North American life. It's a very, very strange thing because we're steeped in it. It's hard for us to see it. I am white. And a lot of people rankle at the idea that there is a whiteness and a definition, because a lot of white people don't like to be defined. They think they're just people, right? At this core, whiteness is rooted in ideology. It's not real. It's simply an ideology that's fraught with false assumptions, these zombie ideas. I'm going to borrow that phrase, which I love quite a bit, from economist Paul Krugman. These are ideas that have been thoroughly discredited by empirical research. However, white is a rubric. It's a racial rubric. And categories are underpinned by social beliefs rooted in political and sociocultural ideas that can lead to this unscientific and ahistorical notion of the superiority of some races over others. Race is again a construct that's been used for political and economic purposes as a bit of a cudgel. And so there's nothing certain or objectively natural about these rubrics and categories. And again, tons of disclaimers here. So it's important to keep in mind that the definition of whiteness and what constitutes Black, Indigenous, persons of color identities, they're socially constructed. We make them up, and they're culturally and politically fluid. So categorizations of race and ethnicity are fraught and in constant flux due to these social, geopolitical alliances and economic shifts, along with other factors. And even renewed frameworks, such as those used by Statistics Canada, which is the methodology I relied upon for this dissertation, they are social constructs too, based on social, cultural ideologies, and again, those political and economic alliances. So I just want to make that very, very clear. And so at the time of writing, Statistics Canada used this very interesting framework for determining race. And it seeks to avoid categorizations that are predicated on, quote, genetically imparted physiogenomical features, among which, skin color is a dominant but not sole attribute. Okay. And this reflects the United Nations guidelines that encourage governments to facilitate both citizens, self-identification as well as identification based on belonging to self-perceived, and this is a quote, groups, regional and local groups, as well as groups that are not usually considered to be ethnic groups, such as religious groups. Okay. And this is from 2017. So this approach replaces Statistics Canada's defunct system of racial categorization, which broke the Canadian population down into 12 major categories. And this is the old methodology. So those categories are Aboriginal, Inuit, Métis, North American Indian. These are quotes. Arab, West Asian, which includes Armenian, Egyptian, Iranian, Lebanese, Moroccan. Black, which includes African, Haitian, Jamaican, Somali. Chinese, Filipino, Japanese, Korean, Latin American, South Asian, Southeast Asian, and then white, Caucasian, and other. Okay, so that was the old framework for Statistics Canada. Statistics Canada's current framework allows respondents to self-identify based on ethnic or cultural origins of the person's ancestor. An ancestor is usually more distant than a grandparent. And again, these are StatsCan definitions. These new sets of categorizations are broken out by roughly continental categorization. So this new framework says there's North American Indigenous origins. There are other North American origins such as Canadian, Albertan, American. There's European origin, Caribbean origins, Latin, Central, and South American origins, African origins, Asian origins, Oceania origins, and those are those new categories. And I used older methodologies particularly, and I regret using U.S. Census Bureau data because there was a lot of inaccuracy, I think, in that model. And I got critiqued, for example, in a definition of whiteness using Middle Eastern, because Middle Eastern was categorized by the U.S. Census as white. And I got a lot of right pushback from people, correct, accurate pushback, saying, as a Middle Eastern person, they didn't really feel like they got the white privilege that others might receive. And so that pushback I really took to heart, looked for a better framework. And I heard from a lot of gamers who said, I'm Middle Eastern and I am not treated as though I were white, despite the fact that that census data would have them in the Caucasian group. So that was really important to me, is to be responsive and to find better solutions based upon feedback, based upon the evolving science, particularly around the definitions of whiteness. And so that was really, really important to me. And I used that framework to make sure that I was making the right decisions about my coding decisions. And then gender identity was done similarly, very carefully, cautiously. There's no question that gender is not a binary, that it's a complex spectrum that does not fall neatly into these binary categories of male and female. And anyone who argues that is wrong. Okay. And so there are no hard and fast categories for gender. So my coding framework was based on seeking designers' self-disclosures. So nobody's going to be plugged into a bucket that like one or another bucket, because gender too is socially constructed and it's fluid and changeable. And I was influenced greatly by the United Nations admonishment about the importance of self-identification. So I looked for online resources and additional information to ensure I was reflecting that game designer's own feelings about their gender and race. And so that was really, really important to me. So I scoured YouTube videos, social media profiles, blog posts, interviews, you name it, to make sure I was getting it right, because that was really, really important to me. Thanks for listening to episode 9. This one's for all the data nerds out there who want to understand how these types of studies come together. I really appreciate you watching. Thanks so much. If you like this video, click the like button, subscribe, or share it with a friend. I'd love to grow my channel a little bit more. And again, thank you so much for listening. It means a lot to me. I hope you have a great day.